As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Attention is good in that it enables us to do cognitive tasks that we couldn't do without attention. So we're good at focusing attention, and that's a good thing. What we seem to be unaware of is the extent to which when we focus attention on one area or aspect or stream of events in our visual world, we don't notice things that are happening elsewhere or in other objects or events. We expect that we're going to notice unexpected things or important things, sort of no matter where they are in our visual field. What happens when we pay attention is that our chance of noticing those things goes down.
That was Christopher Chabris on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are three clinical psychologists here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act Daily Journal, the Act Daily Card Deck, and the upcoming book, Act for Burnout.
I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, a Boston-based clinical psychologist, assistant professor at Brown University, and author of the book Work, Parent, Thrive.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, the Big Book of Act Metaphors, and the upcoming Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Today, we are following up from last week's episode with a re-release of an interview I did about 11 years ago with Christopher Chabris about a book called The Invisible Gorilla: How Our Intuitions Deceive Us. And that's a book that was written by Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons, who we just had on the podcast last week. And about 11 years ago, I interviewed Chris on a different podcast called the New Books Network about The Invisible Gorilla. So I hope that you enjoy hearing a little bit more about that because we referred to it in last week's episode. And I will say, please pardon the audio because it was 11 years ago. And so I did not have the latest technology set up. Podcasting was much newer back then. A lot has improved. I have to say that my skills as an interviewer feel a little bit inexperienced as well when I listen. Chris and I joked that neither of us wanted to listen to it because we were scared of what we sounded like 11 years ago. But I'm going to just let go of that fear and present you with this conversation with Christopher Chabris. Okay, well, let's start with the title of the book, The Invisible Gorilla. Can you tell us about the gorilla experiment that you did? How did you guys come up with that idea, and what did you find?
Well, the title of the book comes from an experiment that my co-author, Dan Simons, and I did when I was in graduate school at Harvard, and Dan had arrived as a new faculty member. And incidentally, my advisor, my mentor, whose lab I was working in, Steve Koslin, was on sabbatical that year, out of the country completely, and Dan was around. His office was right down the hall from me, and started talking, discovered we had some mutual interests. And in particular, I wound up being the teaching fellow for one of Dan's first classes, which was an experimental psychology course. And in that class, undergraduate students designed their own experiments and basically learned how to do experiments in cognitive psychology. But Dan had the clever idea that instead of just having all the students work on their own little individual projects, we would do some group projects. And it's hard to get a project that it takes 10 or 12 people to do in cognitive psychology, but Dan cleverly figured out that if we did some experiments involving filming events. We could have a lot of the students be actors and participate in the filming and then go and test subjects later on. And Dan knew about a classic experiment from the late Ulrich Neisser, but one of the founders of cognitive psychology and real pioneers in the field. And Neisser in the 1970s had done a similar experiment, and we decided to do a different version of it. I'll tell you, I guess, what Neisser's version was after I tell you what our version was. In our version, we filmed the students in the class passing basketballs around, and in particular, 3 of them put on white shirts and 3 of them put on black shirts. And the white-shirted people and the black-shirted people each had their own basketballs. So there are 2 basketballs flying. The white-shirted people passed their ball among themselves, and the black-shirted people passed their ball among themselves. We did this all in sort of an empty space in the psychology building, and a floor that was being renovated at the time. And we later on showed this video. It was about 60 seconds long. We showed the video to subjects in the experiment and asked them to focus on the players wearing white and count the number of times they passed the ball. Actually count silently in their head the number of times they passed the ball. And this is basically a test of selective attention. So you've got to pay attention to what the white people are doing and ignore the people in black shirts. And this is actually a somewhat taxing task. It really requires attention. You can't be doing other things while you're doing this. And then afterwards we asked them how many passes they counted. And then we surprised them with a question after they told us how many passes they had counted. We surprised them with the question, did you see anything else? Or did you see anything unusual? And eventually we asked them, and they mostly said no. Eventually we asked them, did you see a gorilla walk across the screen? And it turned out that we had a person wearing a gorilla suit walk across the screen, and in one version of the experiment, stop, face the camera, thump her chest, and then walk off the screen, being on screen for a total of 9 seconds out of about 60 or 65. And surprisingly, half the people completely did not see that. They reacted mostly with surprise when we asked the question, and when we told them there had been a gorilla there. Some of them said, we need to see the tape, play it back, did you switch the tape, and so on. And it really it was kind of a surprising result to us. Now, Neisser had done something similar earlier. He had filmed it with these mirrors so that everybody looked transparent, and it was though all the people in the video were walking through each other. They looked kind of all like ghosts in some sort of TV show or something like that. And the unexpected event was not a gorilla, but a person carrying an umbrella, a woman carrying an umbrella. So we thought, well, we'll do this again. We'll have all the action live choreographed so people can bump into each other, no transparent ghosts, no weird displays or anything like that. And we'll make it something even more unusual, so it really ought to be noticed, a gorilla. We thought that people would notice the gorilla. We could not believe that the effect was that large and half the people completely missed it.
Yeah, it seems like someone in a gorilla costume would be pretty easy to spot, but apparently not.
Right. So the nice thing about this experiment, I think, is twofold. One, people can miss that, which is kind of interesting that people can miss these salient things that are happening right in front of them. And more interesting to us, actually, as we thought about it more and more, was how surprising people found this result. At the time, we thought we were sort of doing a fun classroom experiment for cognitive psychology, and we did write it up as a paper, and we published it in the journal Perception in 1999, but then we didn't really think much of it after that. But we started hearing from more and more people that they had seen this video somewhere, and actually Malcolm Gladwell wrote about it in the New Yorker in an article about automobile safety, traffic safety. And at that point, interest really picked up, and what surprised us looking back on it was that it really illustrated a contradiction between people's intuitions and the reality of human behavior. People think they're going to notice that, and that's why it's so surprising to them that they don't notice it. It really sort of points out a flaw in their own thinking, and not because they're, unintelligent or uninformed or anything like that. There's something about human nature that gives us the wrong impressions about our own cognitive abilities, and I think that's what this experiment vividly points out.
Well, we're going to be talking about quite a few of those, because that's a theme throughout the book, is how sometimes we're just very wrong about estimating our cognitive abilities.
That's true.
So this one is really about paying attention and the illusion of attention. What does the experiment tell us about attention?
One thing that it tells us about attention is that, for one thing, attention is good in that it enables us to do cognitive tasks that we couldn't do without attention. You can't do the task of counting these passes of this little object flying around at pretty high speed without paying attention. So we're good at focusing attention, and that's a good thing. What we seem to be unaware of is the extent to which when we focus attention on one area or aspect or stream of events in our visual world, we don't notice things that are happening elsewhere or in other objects or events. We expect that we're going to notice unexpected things or important things, sort of no matter where they are in our visual field. What happens when we pay attention is that our chance of noticing those things goes down. And this is not the only experiment that shows this. I mean, not only has this experiment been replicated many times, but this general phenomenon of inattentional blindness, that we can be essentially blind to things we aren't paying attention to, was known before this experiment, and it's been shown in many, many forms.
Well, you mentioned traffic safety a few minutes ago. Could you tell us how something like finding about attention might apply to driving?
Yeah, that's really a key. It's sort of like the one most basic takeaway from this research is that when you are concentrating on a primary task, which in our experiment would be counting the passes of these people with the basketball, you are much less likely than you realize to notice other things or to be able to react to other things that are outside of the primary task. So the classic example of this in traffic safety is people who are talking on the phone, or even worse, of course, texting or emailing or, playing Angry Birds or something like that on their phone while they're also driving. And they have the illusion, in my opinion, that because they are looking outside the windshield and looking at what they normally look at and taking everything in, they have the illusion that they're actually noticing all the important stuff. And the illusion comes in part from the very sort of fluid and automatic processing that goes on during driving. We feel like we're having a rich visual experience. We don't sort of feel like we're not seeing things. And also the lack of feedback, because we actually rarely do have accidents when we're talking on the phone. It's not as though every second time you talk on the phone, you crash your car into something. If that's what would happen, then you would learn that it's a really bad idea. But it's, if someone swerves to miss you, you may never have noticed that, and you don't get any feedback about how badly you're actually driving. You basically don't know what you're missing is one way of putting it. As long as you keep missing it and it doesn't run into you, then you don't get any feedback about how bad your attention actually is. And the experiment, in fact, sort of gives people that feedback. It does sort of give them an instant lesson, in a sense, in how much they can be missing.
Yeah, we like to fool ourselves into thinking that, this isn't a problem, but it is. Do you have any other examples of how the illusion of attention or those blind spots can affect our daily lives?
Yeah, this has happened in a lot of different areas. I heard an interesting story when I gave a talk, actually. Sometimes people ask, is there such thing as inattentional deafness? And the answer is yes, although it doesn't really go by that name, but it certainly is possible to miss otherwise salient sounds and words and sentences and other things like that when you're paying attention to one conversation or one particular stream. I mean, you only have to think about sort of like a little kid like concentrating on Spider-Man on TV or something like that, completely oblivious to what you're saying to them. Someone asked me in a talk once that they had been playing some sport or something like that, and it was a pretty rough and physical game. I don't remember what sport it was. And only half an hour later, after he was done, did he look down and notice that there was a big cut in his leg and blood had been coming out of it. And he didn't feel it at all, didn't feel the cut, didn't feel it afterwards, and sort of ascribed that to concentrating so much on what he had to do. Maybe it was soccer or something like that didn't even think about that sort of inattentional numbness is one way of thinking about that. I've never seen that term in the literature, but maybe that's a way of putting it. I think it's not just a visual thing. It's a general feature of our sensory systems. And it's probably also a more general feature of cognition also. If you sort of don't pay attention to information or events, you may not realize that you're not paying attention to them, you're not taking them into account. You may think that you're taking into account all the information you need when making a decision, but in fact, you're not. There are many other examples in safety. There's a famous case where a U.S. nuclear submarine surfaced into a Japanese fishing boat off the coast of Hawaii, basically split the poor boat in half and caused several deaths. And the captain of the submarine had done a periscope sweep before he went and did this maneuver, and he didn't see any boats around. At least that's what he says afterwards. And nobody else saw any boats around. And then he surfaced right into this thing. There have been other incidents with airplanes that could be ascribed to inattentional blindness. And it's really a much more ubiquitous phenomenon than we realize. And I think, most people in everyday life, human nature is not to notice these limitations exactly because they have to do with things you don't see or don't feel or don't hear or don't think about. So how, by definition, how do those things come to your attention? How do you find out about those things? So this is happening a lot, I think, and it's an interesting feature of the design of the mind that we have these wrong impressions about how well our sensory and cognitive systems are performing.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because you think the ability to concentrate on something is usually considered a good thing, but there's a downside. When you're concentrating so hard on one thing, you're missing a lot of other, there's just so much information out there, you're missing a lot of other information.
Yeah, and I think the ability to concentrate is a good thing. I mean, people say, well, how can I learn to, spot the gorilla? How can I be the person who doesn't see the gorilla, who doesn't miss the gorilla, who actually sees the gorilla in everyday life? And I was sort of worried that even if there were some magic way of doing that, it would have to result in some kind of depletion of your ability to concentrate on the main task. And I think people shortchange the value of concentrating on one task. It's harder nowadays to concentrate on one task because just the volume of potential distractions is higher. What with the internet, TV, just the general complexity of society and a number of demands on our time and so on. So I think sometimes people have tried to flip that into a virtue. Well, maybe they'll try to say, well, I'm good at multitasking. I can do multiple things at once. It's good not to pay too much attention to any one thing. But in fact, performance goes way down when you do that. And the inability to focus or the tendency not to focus, I don't think is the right solution to this problem.
Right. We have enough multitasking as it is. Facebook, all that, Twitter.
Exactly.
Yeah, another experiment that I thought was really fascinating was the person change experiment. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so these experiments were started by Dan Simons and his colleague Dan Levin, who he was in graduate school together with at Cornell. And they came up with this idea for almost a candid camera kind of experiment. It turns out Candid Camera had done something similar years earlier, or some sort of show like Candid Camera. They actually sent an experimenter out to the quad at Cornell. And again, this has been repeated in many other situations, so this is not sort of a one-off. This really works. They sent an experimenter out to the quad at Cornell, and he would just ask unsuspecting passersby for directions to some building, like the gym or something like that. And as the passerby, who is now a subject in the experiment, although he doesn't know it yet, as he's giving directions to the experimenter, two other experimenters walk down the path and rudely cut between them while carrying a large door on its side. So the effect of this, if you can visualize it, is that while the door is passing between them, one of the people carrying the door is able to switch places with the experimenter. So the experimenter now is going off carrying the door, but both of the people carrying the door are behind the door, so the subject in the experiment can't see the switch happening. So once the door passes by, the subject in the experiment now sees a person who continues the conversation as though he was the original person who was there. And surprisingly, half of the people in this experiment did not realize they were talking to a completely different person after the door went by. And, they were both white males dressed like students, but they differed in height, they differed in the sound of their voice, they differed in what they were wearing, they had different color jackets or something like that. I mean, there were some significant differences between them. And when you put them side by side, they look like completely different people. So this phenomenon was described by Dan Simons and Dan Levin as change blindness, meaning a blindness or an inability to notice significant changes that happen to your visual world, usually when your attention is distracted and put on something else. So, if the subject is talking to the experimenter and the experimenter just sort of like walks off and gets replaced by another experimenter, of course it's going to get noticed every time because your attention is drawn to the moment of the change and you see one person being replaced by another. But if your attention is distracted, it seems like you're very unlikely to notice these changes, or at least much more unlikely than you would think going in. So people have described these experiments to other people and said, what if you were a subject in this experiment? Would you notice? And almost everybody says, yes, they would notice. So again, people sort of overestimate their ability to notice these changes. Here it's more of an issue of memory because you're sort of not comparing the memory you had of the person you were talking to before the change event to what you're looking at right in front of you now. It's not the same exact thing as inattentional blindness, but it's related. But it's more a phenomenon of memory rather than of attention.
Yeah, so we would overestimate that, thinking that we'd be pretty good at that, knowing when a person changes into another person, and yet, again, we're giving ourselves too much credit there, at least in this kind of situation.
Yeah, we think we're keeping track of more information in our experience than we really are. did this study again, a different version of it at Harvard when Dan was a professor and I was a grad student there. The ethics committee at Harvard didn't want us to run the study the same way that Dan had at Cornell. And the problem was that we were basically approaching people and making them subjects in the experiment without revealing this to them. And so we came up with a way around that. We actually had people go into the lobby of the psychology building, which is, a tall, I think it's about 15 stories tall, and they were recruited for an experiment in the lobby and then told to go up to the 8th floor. And when they get to the 8th floor in the elevator and they come out, there's a sign that says experiment here with a counter. And they went to the counter and there was an experimenter standing behind the counter and handed them a form and said, okay, fill out this consent form and then the experiment will start. So the subject fills out the consent form just like they always do. Maybe they read it carefully, maybe they didn't. They sign it and hand it back to the experimenter. And then the experimenter ducks down behind the counter and another experimenter pops up to replace him and now gives some other instructions, like take this piece of paper and go down the hall. And that was the change right there. So technically it happened after they'd filled out the consent form, but before they really realized the experiment had started. They were expecting to be told, okay, now go down the hall and the experiment will start down there. So in this case, again, many people did not notice the change. And even some people who had come directly from a lecture elsewhere in the building that had talked about change blindness happened to stumble into this experiment, and even they did not notice the change. So just purely being aware of it doesn't mean your cognitive system suddenly resets so that you expect this to happen all the time. Just knowing about these things or having heard about them once doesn't change the way you experience the world and change the way your attention and memory work. Unfortunately, I wish it were that easy.
Oh, yeah. And I've read your book now. I'm kind of expecting that I'm going to not make this kind of mistake anymore. Not true, huh?
Well, I mean, you're better off than if you didn't read it. I'll never say that it's a bad thing to read my book. Everyone should read it and buy 3 copies each, of course, but give 2 to your friends. But it's one of those cases where it's good to read and it's good to be aware of this, but then you have to think, well, what do I do in my life that reflects the illusion? So we call this one the illusion of memory. What we've just been talking about is the belief that we're encoding and remembering events in our lives much more accurately and permanently and objectively than we really are. You have to think about what are you doing in your life that reflects this illusion? For example, one thing people do is they argue with other people over who said what, 2 or 3 weeks ago in some conversation or something like that. And unfortunately, memory research suggests that the most likely situation there is that neither person is right in the argument. And the one who wins is not going to be the one who, whose memory was closer to the truth or anything like that. It's just going to be the one who doesn't give up. And right, and that argument is a complete waste of time and probably makes things worse in whatever relationship you have with this person, especially, if you're married to them or, related to them or somehow. Memory is just not that perfect, but the more important problem is that we don't realize it's not that perfect, so we wind up arguing with people over whose memory is more accurate. And, of course, we have criminal trials over, issues largely determined by memory. So if you're ever on a jury or you're ever involved in heaven forbid, a crime or a serious situation like that where guilt or innocence or liability turns on memory, you've got to be aware that people's memories are not nearly as good as they think they are, and your fellow jurors or other people, if you work in law enforcement, the other people you work with may have an incorrect theory or an incorrect belief about how good memory is. And, the truth may not be served by having this illusion that we're going to remember things much more accurately and objectively than we really are.
Well, speaking of which, September 11th, you mentioned this in your book, and I think I can remember very vividly my personal experience on that day, when the news broke, and I remember where I was, and these are flashbulb memories for, when these big, real traumatic events happen, these really emotionally charged events happen. How likely do you think it is that my memories of that day are accurate?
I wouldn't want to put a percentage on it right now, especially after you've read the book. Maybe you've gone back and done some research on this to check on your memory, but I can say for myself that I have a very vivid memory of what I was doing when I heard about 9/11. And I think as we mentioned in the book, I was in graduate school at the time, so I was kind of on a little bit of a sleep late calendar. When I woke up, I believe, heard about this by listening to Howard Stern on the radio, of all things. And I was alone at home, and so on. And I have some other recollections of what happened that day. And it does seem very vivid to me. I obviously don't remember what I was doing on September 10th or September 12th or any of those other days around there except in the most, vague and general terms. And you're not alone. So you're not alone in having this experience. In fact, in the book, we wrote about Dan's memories. Dan wrote out a detailed memory of how he experienced 9/11. And there were various people in his memory. So fortunately, since he was a professor and the people in his memory were his graduate students at the time who are now still in contact with him, he sent them an email and said, "Send me back your recollection of 9/11. And it turns out that there were significant discrepancies among all of these recollections that they have, several of which pointed to Dan not being right, because he remembered people being there that nobody else remembered being there. And then there was someone else who was there that Dan didn't remember, but the other people did. But nobody was completely correct about it. They couldn't have all been completely correct about it because there were too many discrepancies. And this, if you think about it, this is for a salient event that everybody has, as you say, a flashbulb memory for, a feeling as though, a flash photograph was taken and it's imprinted in your memory and will never go away somehow. Ulrich Neisser, the same researcher who had done the gorilla experiment, did really the definitive experiment on flashbulb memories. And it was a genius maneuver. He and his co-author, after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in 1986, had their students fill out a form indicating what they had experienced. I believe it was the day before. So at this point, they probably hadn't had too much time to distort this memory. It was still very fresh in their minds. And then came back to them about 2 years later before they graduated and asked them to recall their experience again, and found many, many, many discrepancies between them. But they also found that the people believed completely that their memories were accurate. And in fact, they mentioned that one student was shown his handwritten answers from 2 years earlier, the day after the explosion. And he said, "Yes, that's my handwriting, but I don't remember it happening that way. That's not how it happened. I admit that that's my handwriting, but that's not how it happened." The distortion in memory that had happened over those 2 years, not a deliberate distortion or anything like that, just the natural changes that happened to our memories, was so powerful that even being shown what he originally wrote, it didn't sort of like snap that memory back into place or anything like that. He still felt more strongly in the memory in his head than in his own documentary evidence. So, like you said, and think of the implications for criminal trials and how much weight people place on memory versus other kinds of information. And just in your own daily life, how much you pay attention to your memories. One thing people don't realize is that we actually are leaving now, with all these computers and devices and so on around us, we're leaving more and more paper trails. They're not really written on paper anymore. But one thing I did after writing up that chapter for the book was I went back to my email, actually. And years later, I still had my inbox, my saved messages, and my sent mails from that day, and found some things about 9/11 that I had not remembered. But they were sort of noted there as a result of emails I had sent that day or I had received.
So I probably remember September 11th better than, say, September 8th of that same year. But I might be overestimating how accurate I might think I'm more accurate than I actually am in my memory.
I'm not sure you're even remembering September 11th better than September 8th.
Huh.
So people have done studies like that where that was sort of the next generation. These flashbulb memory studies sort of they come along kind of episodically because usually they depend on an event happening that sort of everyone is aware of and has an emotional impact on everyone. Right, so the space shuttle explosion in 1986 was one. 9/11 is another one. There aren't that many sort of universally familiar events. The original ones that were studied were the Lincoln assassination, believe it or not, in the 19th century, and then the JFK assassination. So presidential assassinations, fortunately, are few and far between, and national disasters are as well. So when 9/11 came around, a couple of researchers whose names elude me right now, but we do mention them in the book. Had people write down their memories for, I think, either the day before or the day after, and then for 9/11. And again, they did this within a day or two of the actual event. So those things were written down, on 9/13, let's say, as the truth, and then followed up a year or two later to see what had changed. And they found that the memories had distorted just as much. So the memories of 9/10 were just as inaccurate as the memories of 9/11. But the confidence in the memories of 9/11 was extremely high, whereas people realized that they weren't too sure about 9/10. They thought they were really sure about 9/11. So in the book we say, instead of a sort of a flashbulb memory, What it is really sort of like a belief device. What the flashbulb does is it makes you believe that you've recorded a permanent memory. It makes you very confident in your memory of that day, but it doesn't really actually make a permanent imprint the way we think it does. All memories are subject to distortion, even the ones you think are the most perfect.
Yeah, and we may construct some pieces of it after the fact.
Yes. Whenever we recall a memory, what we're doing is constructing that memory by assembling different pieces of experience from different places. Often we fill things in because we think that's what should have happened, or because what we recall in lieu of the truth satisfies some other motives we have. So Hillary Clinton, for example, in the presidential election, when she was running against Barack Obama for the Democratic nomination, she told a story about being under sniper fire in Bosnia, and which was untrue because the video came out later of her landing, and there was a nice welcoming ceremony, and no one was ducking and covering and so on. And she probably just didn't toss this out in casual conversation. She was running for president against someone she viewed as much less experienced, especially in the area of international affairs. So the memories she created, just like the memories we all create all the time, were somewhat consistent with her motives and beliefs at the time. She was more experienced in international affairs, and that was a strong suit of her campaign. And that's partly explains, in my view, why she said what she said.
Interesting. She probably completely believed it, and
I bet at the time, yeah. I mean, there's no. Unfortunately, I wish I were a good enough cognitive psychologist that I could get inside Hillary Clinton's head or anyone else's head and figure out exactly what's the truth and what's not the truth. It's not really even clear to me that the truth is in there somewhere.
Yeah.
The things that happen that distort our memories may be, in a sense, permanently changing the originals. I don't think it's the case that the truth is sort of down in there somewhere and we just have to uncover it. That's more kind of personal opinion, but I do suspect that Hillary Clinton, when she told that Bosnia story, actually believed that that's what happened to her and just thought she was telling a story. And, maybe when those news reports came out, we don't know, but when the news reports came out, she might have said, well, that's true. That's a video of me, but that's not the way I remember it. So I don't know, though. We never got the chance to ask her.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, maybe someday.
Well, tell us about the illusion of confidence, how sometimes we maybe tend to be a little overly confident in our estimation of our abilities.
So the illusion of confidence is the third illusion that we talk about in the book. In the book, we call these things everyday illusions, the idea being that they are illusions about our own minds that affect us every day. At least one of them, and probably many of them, are affecting us every day in all kinds of decisions we make. And confidence is one of the most important ones. There are actually there are really two illusions of confidence. One is the illusion that our own skills and abilities are better than they really are. So we have too much confidence in our own performance, and we pay too much attention to confidence in other people, which is in a way, sort of a corollary. So if people are overconfident in their own abilities, we really shouldn't be paying that much attention to how confident people are, but we do pay a lot of attention to how confident people are. The classic example is, the witness on the stand in a criminal trial, or let's say testifying before Congress or some other, body, or a deposition or something. The witness who seems poised, confident, self-assured, smooth, remembers everything with complete clarity and conviction is going to be a much more convincing witness, and people are going to believe her much more. Now, it's not the case that a confident witness, that confidence means nothing. Confident eyewitnesses, research has showed, are more likely to be correct than unconfident eyewitnesses. But we tend to think that their confidence is a better reflection of their accuracy than it really is. So, for example, confident witnesses are right 70% of the time. Unconfident witnesses are right 30% of the time. But that leaves still, for a confident witness who's right 70% of the time, they're still wrong 30% of the time. So 30% is probably enough for a reasonable doubt, so that, probably a criminal verdict based on just one confident witness is a little bit shakier than we realize. And that's just for eyewitness testimony. There are many other areas where we pay too much attention to the confidence of other people.
You wrote about how we prefer experts who think they know a lot. And one area that this happens is in medicine, and how we rate our doctors. And it's funny because just the other day, my mom was telling me that she found a new doctor, and the only thing she said about the doctor was that the doctor seemed nervous. And I thought of your book because, well, tell us about how this might apply to medicine.
Yeah, there are some areas where you don't want to see nervousness, right? Like you don't want You don't want to walk on the airplane and look in the cockpit and see that the pilot looks nervous. That should be unsettling, right? And a doctor who looks nervous while they're about to sort of, start surgery on you or something like that, ought to be a little unsettling. But an experience I had, which turned out later on to be, there was a research study on this. I didn't realize at the time. But again, when I was in graduate school, I had these flu symptoms and I had this weird, rash on my back of my leg. And I hadn't seen the rash, but I went into the clinic, the health services, and they said, well, it's a flu, drink lots of fluids and take aspirin and so on. But then the next day I saw this weird rash and I went back and I said, hey, look at this thing down here on my leg. I didn't notice this before. And then at that point, the doctor who was on duty did something I'd never seen before. She left the room and came back with a book and opened it up and compared the picture in her book to what was on my leg. And she said, hey, look, she didn't say, hey, look, that was a little bit of an embellishment there. But she said, this is a classic Lyme disease rash. You've been bitten by this tick and gotten Lyme disease from it, and your rash looks exactly like the one in the book. And I said, okay, that was a little bit unsettling. Lyme disease can be scary. And then she did it again. She went and got another book and looked up the treatment. And the treatment is a certain course of antibiotics. And then she prescribed it, and I left, and I had never been in, an encounter with a doctor where they had looked things up in books, and this happened twice in the same medical encounter. I thought at the time that was a little bit odd. Now, I did follow the prescription, and everything got better, and I was, back to normal. But it's not that unusual for people to pay attention to sort of the confidence and the quickness and so on of the doctor more than they should. Someone did a research study where they actually sort of showed videotaped encounters with doctors to subjects who were potential patients and had them rate how much they liked the doctor. And the doctors who consulted reference materials got the lowest ratings of anyone. The doctor who got the highest ratings was the one who immediately wrote out a prescription and said, go on your way, even while admitting that they weren't sure whether it was necessary. I think we have this tendency, as you say, to assume that if someone's acting quickly and decisively and so on, that must mean they know what they're doing. And if someone consults reference materials or hesitates or consults other experts, that's a bad sign. But in fact, the reverse might be true. I'd sort of rather have someone who looks up the diagnosis and confirms it than someone who is so confident that they don't need to, because that person who's so confident might be wrong and not even realize it.
They might completely miss it.
Yeah, they might completely miss it, but you'll never know because they thought they were 100% correct and they just, hand you a prescription and off you go. But if they actually discuss with you some of the considerations and the alternatives and the reasons for their decision and so on, you should then be more confident, I think.
So you mentioned that even experts in a field can be way off the mark. Sometimes they think they know more than they actually do about things. This is the illusion of knowledge. Could you tell us how that might apply to something like investing?
Yeah, so investing is a great example of a field, at least investment advice, let me put it that way. And also, I think a lot of investing, a field that is basically owes its existence to the illusion of knowledge. And the illusion of knowledge is our tendency to believe that we understand complex things more deeply and correctly than we actually do. It's not the same as the illusion of confidence. Confidence is sort of confidence in our own abilities or our own memories or our own skills. Whereas the illusion of knowledge is the belief that our knowledge is deeper than it really is. A prime example happens with the stock market. There's a whole genre of books that you can buy with titles like, Dow 30,000, Dow 40,000, Dow 100,000. These are all actual books that were actually published and actually sold, which have explain this very simple theory explaining why the value of the Dow Jones Industrial Average is going to hit 40,000 within a certain number of years or whatever. And they give you, an investment, plan to follow based on this. And there is no way that these people writing these books know as much about the stock market as they think they do. Incidentally, all those books, are now out of print or, selling for, 5 cents each or something like that on Amazon. There's a great temptation to reduce a complex system, and the global financial markets are sort of, in a way, the ultimate complex system. What the Greek government is doing at any one point in time affects the bottom line of everybody in the rest of the world now in terms of the value of their their financial assets. It's an incredibly complex system. To think that that can be reduced to a simple model that you can then act on and successfully make money that other people aren't making is a prime example of the illusion of knowledge. One reason why it persists is that surely some people do make more money than others in the stock market, and some people make a lot less money. Some people lose all their money, some people make fortunes, but we underestimate how much of that is due to randomness, chance, luck, accidental good timing. They just happen to have money to invest when the stock market happened to be on its way up, or just lucky picks, all kinds of other reasons why some people win and some people lose besides actual knowledge of the system. And yet the people who win wind up writing the books and giving the advice, and they go on TV and, every night they'll say, buy this, sell that, buy this, sell that, and they can't possibly know things with as much depth or confidence, for that matter, as they display.
If only it was that simple.
And actually, it's funny. It's not just complex systems. I mean, if it were just a matter of, well, we'll just sort of not make predictions about complex systems and we won't worry about those. But people even overestimate their knowledge of simple things. There's a great study by a British researcher who asked people how well they thought they understood how a bicycle works. And they would rate this on a scale of 1 to 7. Sort of 1 would be, I have no idea how a bicycle works, to 7 being, I have a very good understanding of bicycles. And then she surprised them by asking them to draw a bicycle. And I wish I could show you in an audio interview what these pictures look like. But they would do things like have the chain connect both wheels of the bicycle. So, for example, if you think about it, if you're riding a bicycle and the chain connects both wheels, anytime you try to steer or turn, you're going to be bending the chain, and the chain is going to snap right off or the bicycle is going to fall down. There was no possible way to ride that bike. So what's going on here? Well, people think their knowledge is higher, and that's evidenced by their ratings, than it actually is. But, of course, they can ride the bicycle perfectly well. They know how to ride a bicycle. And if they looked at a bicycle, they could probably explain, oh, yeah, if the chain connects both wheels, then it can't possibly work. The chain needs to connect the pedal to the back wheel, and that's how you power the bike. And then the front wheel needs to be free to move and so on. But they don't think of all that stuff when they're asked to rate their own knowledge. And these are the questions that people don't ask themselves when they invest. Right? They don't say, well, do I really understand whether Apple is going to go up from being worth $550 billion or down? What do I really understand? How much do I understand about Apple's competitors, Apple's products, everything else in the global computer and internet industry and music industry and so on? They don't really ask those questions. They form an impression based on an intuition, which doesn't really match reality.
Wow. Tell us about the illusion of cause and effect.
So, the illusion of cause is kind of related to those last two illusions. And the idea is that we believe that we understand cause and effect better than we actually do. One way we do that is by generalizing from single experiences, especially experiences where one thing happened and then something else happened. And we tend to assume that the first thing that happened caused the second thing, if there's any kind of logical connection we can come up with between the two. So a classic example is vaccination. As most people know nowadays, it's gotten a lot of publicity. There are beliefs that autism has increased in prevalence over the last 10 or 20 years because vaccines can cause autism as a side effect. And people have sort of formed that belief on the basis of either hearing celebrity commentary about it, hearing celebrities talk about it and espouse those beliefs, or maybe occasionally some doctors also who say them, or maybe experiencing themselves that their child started showing some symptoms of autism shortly after receiving one of their vaccines, typically the measles, mumps, and rubella, the MMR vaccine, which happens around age 2 or so. And it's not completely illogical. Some needle is put in and some foreign substance is, injected, and then your behavior starts to change at some point after that. It's not an illogical connection to make. The problem is sort of twofold. One, we're very good at making those connections. We're very good at finding patterns in our behavior and our environment. And two, we're fairly unaffected by hearing about scientific evidence against those beliefs. So if this were true, you'd expect people who have gotten MMR vaccinations to have a higher rate of autism than people who haven't. And people have actually gone and looked at this in data sets covering hundreds of thousands or millions of children. There's actually no difference in the likelihood of autism between people who've had vaccinations and people who haven't. And this has been settled, over and over again in many medical journal articles, and there's really no serious debate over that point. But one of the sort of foibles of the human mind, or one of the illusions that we have, is that sort of abstract data on hundreds of thousands of people in medical studies doesn't penetrate our thinking and our beliefs as much as a single good story from a celebrity, from a friend, from ourselves, or whatever. So that's the illusion of cause, is the tendency to sort of believe in cause and effect when we don't have evidence for it, and maybe to discount evidence that really would be valuable in explaining it.
And in this case, isn't it the case that the onset of the symptoms of autism are first usually detected around that same time? So it's more of just a coincidence in timing. Isn't that the case?
If something happened 5 years later, then we'd be much less likely to ascribe cause and effect. So we tend to sort of pick the cause that is most logical and easy to connect to the effect. And in this case, if the cause is close in time before the effect, the supposed effect, I should say, and is plausibly somehow related, and, an injection of something, could change your behavior, that makes sense, right? Then we're much more likely to make the connection than, most kids probably get read Goodnight Moon, around the same time, but, nobody's saying that Goodnight Moon causes autism. It's not logical that it could. There's some logic to an injection being able to cause autism, but it's the coincidence, the temporal coincidence, that it happens to happen around the same age as autism symptoms first become detectable, that and then autism first gets diagnosed, that causes people to make this connection. I think also that the fact that celebrities who believe in this connection sort of repeatedly get a platform in the media is a part of the problem also. That people might not necessarily believe something because Jenny McCarthy believes it, but Jenny McCarthy gets to talk about her beliefs to Oprah and Larry King and others over and over again, whereas people who explain the reality of vaccines and autism are not as popular as celebrities. They don't get as much of a platform, and they just don't draw as much attention as celebrities do. Interestingly, why we pay so much attention to celebrities is another interesting foible of the human mind. There's really no logic. There's really no logic as to why Jenny McCarthy should know anything more about parenting than the average other, new mother in the country. But people pay attention to her when she talks about it. That's a whole interesting question of human nature right there. That I haven't figured that one out yet, but I think there's something interesting to that.
Me either. Well, maybe that could be your next book. So people might be disappointed if they read your book to find out that sometimes we think some activities will make us smarter, like listening to Mozart, doing crossword puzzles. But tell us about that. Is that really true? And what happened here with the Mozart Effect?
So people may remember the Mozart Effect. Actually, it's been almost 20 years now since the Mozart Effect was first discovered, or at least announced in an article in Nature, the prestigious scientific journal. And the researchers who discovered it claimed that if you listen to Mozart's music for about 10 minutes, that you will then do about 8 or 9 points better on an IQ test that you take right afterwards, and that therefore Mozart's effect has sort of a short-term enhancing effect on cognitive ability. And as a result of this, people started doing things like playing Mozart's music in libraries and, more importantly, buying CDs of Mozart's music to listen to, or buying the music to play to their newborn babies, on the logic that if this works on college students who were the subjects in the original experiment, it ought to work even better on newborns who are ready to soak up whatever nature, whatever the environment provides for them. There were actually
hence the multi-million-dollar industry of Baby Einstein and that kind of thing, right?
The Baby Einstein company, which is now a brand that is inescapable for new parents. There are Baby Einstein toothbrushes, there are Baby Einstein everything, but it started out as a DVDs, and that company was started in the wake of the Mozart Effect, news report. This idea that somehow, early enrichment with classical music or other things seemingly associated with geniuses like Mozart, Einstein, Bach, so on, would be a big booster to people's brain power, was very popular. And in the book, we argue that this reflects something we call the illusion of potential, which is sort of a recurrent belief that there's got to be some easy way to make ourselves smarter. And it's not just smarter, of course. This often applies to health and beauty and other areas. We sort of have a tendency to sort of believe or hope that there are quick and easy ways to achieve really dramatic results. Thin thighs in 30 days or whatever. There's always some. Usually the things we want to achieve are achievable, right? Like we can get smarter. In fact, we put our children through 12 plus years of public education, not just to get them out of the house, but because we think it's actually going to make them smarter, right? There's something about going through the educational system that gives you more knowledge and skills and abilities and vocabulary and all kinds of other stuff. But that takes 12 years, and it's very expensive. It's much nicer if we could do it in 10 minutes or maybe an hour or 2 hours or something like that. But basically, the summary of all the literature that has looked at these sort of get smart quick schemes has found that they don't work. At best, what they do is they make you better at doing the thing that you're doing. So, you do a lot of crosswords, you get better at doing crosswords. You might learn a few words along the way, but you're not generally going to make your brain bigger or, boost your brain power and so on. Playing video games, especially those brain games that Nintendo and other companies have sold, make you better at playing the games, but so far there's no good evidence that they make you better at anything else. Like, doing memory games on your handheld computer or your smartphone or whatever won't necessarily make you any better at remembering where your car is in the parking lot or remembering where your keys were when you can't find them or any of those things that I think are the reasons why people are motivated to do this. There was a TV commercial for one of them where someone runs into an old friend on the street and can't remember his name. And the implication is that if you would only play our brain games, then you would, not have these kind of senior moments happen to you at age 45 or whatever the guy was. It turns out there are ways to improve those skills and abilities. You practice the skills and abilities you want to improve. It's kind of obvious advice. And you get your general health in good shape, especially your aerobic fitness, because it probably is the case that improving blood flow to the brain is sort of like the single best thing you can do for your brain power. The brain relies on blood, which carries glucose and oxygen and all kinds of other things that the cells in the brain require. And if you can improve the flow of blood to your brain, that's probably the one best thing you can do. So that's aerobic. That's the same thing that improves the flow of blood to your rest of your body, aerobic conditioning. And there have been some credible studies on that show that has an effect. But unfortunately, I wish it were as easy as doing crossword puzzles and so on, because those things are fun.
Yeah, I think we'd all like to think that we could skip the gym and, play a few games or listen to some music instead, but not. Unfortunately, there's, I guess, no shortcut like that. Yeah.
In the case of Mozart, by the way, there have been many studies on the Mozart effect because it was so startling that people figured we've got to go try this in our own lab. If this really works, this is tremendous. And the net result of all of those studies, of which there have been dozens now, is that either there is no Mozart effect, or what the Mozart effect really comes from is that when you listen to something that puts you in a good mood or slightly arouses you, not arouses you sexually, but arouses you cognitively, so you're sort of more alert and attentive right afterwards, then you're going to do a little bit better on cognitive tests than you do after that. So it's a good idea to sort of put yourself in a good mood and a slightly aroused mood before a test or before an important meeting or something like that. But that doesn't mean you're boosting up your IQ, by any significant amount or anything like that. It's just sort of good preparation to perform at your peak.
So as we're kind of wrapping up this interview here, I'm wondering if you can think of any overall, I guess, suggestions from your research and from the book. How can we use this? So now we've kind of learned that we have all these, illusions and some shortcomings cognitively. Any suggestions for how we can use this in our lives?
Yeah, I think being aware of how your mind really works is of tremendous value. I try to put this stuff into work myself, into action myself. And one thing I do is I'm very sorely tempted, now that my phone can do anything a computer can do, I'm very, very sorely tempted to use it while I'm driving. I should be paying attention to other things. So one thing you can do is, zip it up in your briefcase or purse or backpack, and then put that thing in the back seat so you can't even unzip it and access it while you're driving. So change your environment to make you less prone to fall victim to these illusions. In the case of the illusion of cause, don't read bad science and advice books that are based purely on people's personal experiences. Don't pay attention to celebrities. I mean, I probably didn't need to tell people, this, to not pay attention to celebrities. But the celebrities are different from you and me in so many ways. They've all got personal trainers. They've all got, chefs, and so on. Anything they suggest to do to improve their lives is not what's really working for them. In the case of memory, think about how accurate memory really is the next time you get into any kind of dispute that's involved in memory. And think about the different ways that you could check your own memory. If there's something important that you're opining on and you're doing it from memory, think about whether there's any way you can check it. How many of us ever go back in our calendar, our calendar program on our computer or, our Filofax or whatever, how many of us ever go back and look at what we really were doing on some date? Or go back to our saved mail or our sent mail and look at what we said to people in the past. Maybe we actually have records of a lot of stuff that instead we rely on our memories for. Don't trust people who say they have a perfect memory of something. Don't trust people who say they're absolutely certain of things. People who say they're absolutely certain of things are almost by definition overconfident. Don't trust people who give you such one-sided or automatic advice and so on. They're probably suffering from the illusion of knowledge. And, of course, don't waste your money on brain games and so on unless you just enjoy playing them. But don't think that it's going to actually make you instantly smarter. And one thing I tell my students is look for examples of this in your own life or in the news or whatever. And if you start looking at the world sort of through the lenses of these illusions, you can start to get a lot of insights into other people's behavior and understand why other people are doing things. In the case of Hillary Clinton, if everybody had realized the way memory works, they wouldn't have all just started calling her a liar. I mean, she might have gotten out of that episode of the Bosnian snipers and so on if it hadn't been that people were writing editorials saying, well, she's either a liar or she's mentally ill or whatever. If people wrote an editorial saying, well, that's the way memory works. Sometimes people get it wrong. Memory is constructive and so on. Things would have been different. I think the world would be a little bit better place if people understood this stuff more.
Mm. Absolutely. So what are you working on now, Chris?
Well, we're actually doing some follow-up studies to some of the ideas in the book. Writing the book was actually kind of inspirational for me, and I think Dan also, in thinking about new research we can do. So we're working on some stuff like that. And I also research in several other areas. So one of the interesting ones that I've been working on lately is on collective intelligence. So collective intelligence is the idea that groups of people can be surprisingly intelligent if they pool their abilities in the right ways. They can not only be smarter than individual members, but in the case of our research, we found that some groups are sort of systematically smarter than other groups. And by groups, I mean sort of like teams of 3, 4, 5 people working together on projects. And not just because the smarter groups have smarter people in them. Actually, 2 groups can have individual members who are just as smart, but groups whose members are better at perceiving emotional expressions and who do a better job of taking turns and sort of sharing the floor in discussion. And interestingly enough, groups with more women in them tend to have higher collective intelligence and tend to outperform other groups. So we've been working on sort of understanding what collective intelligence is, how we can measure it, and then thinking about sort of what we can do to enable groups to be smarter. So this is sort of a new area, of research that I've been working on in the past few years, and I'm pretty excited about that.
Well, that sounds great. Very interesting work. Well, I want to thank you and Dan Simons for writing this really fascinating book. I really recommend that people read it. And also, I really enjoyed talking with you.
I had a good time. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care. Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our strategic consultant, Michael Harold, and our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're having a mental health emergency, dial 911. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.